Tonight, we travel back to the edge of time, to a city that once held the mind of the world. Alexandria, where poets, philosophers, and scientists gathered beneath one roof, believing that knowledge itself was divine. But what happens when light burns too brightly, when truth threatens power, and wisdom becomes heresy? The library fell in fire, yet its spirit escaped the flames. Tonight, we follow its ghost, through centuries of silence, through sand, scripture, and science, to find the ember that still burns within us all. If this kind of storytelling brings you inner peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where in the world are you listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always strangely comforting to know who else is out there closing their eyes to the same lullaby. So settle in, let the world grow quiet, and let's dream together for a while. It began with a vision, not of conquest, but of creation. On a morning washed in the pale gold of eternity, a young conqueror stood upon the edge of the known world, where the Nile met the sea. His name was Alexander, a man who carried empires in his shadow, yet looked beyond them, towards something greater than dominion. He sought not merely to rule men, but to build a place where the gods of every people might walk together, speaking the language of the stars. The wind off the Mediterranean smelled of salt and myth. The sand whispered of Egypt's ancient dead, and the horizon gleamed like a blade. It was here, upon this threshold between earth and eternity, that Alexander drew his circle in the sand, a city born not from war, but from the hunger for immortality. He called it Alexandria. It would be the meeting place of worlds, Greece and Egypt, Asia and Africa, East and West. A city of marble and sunlight, reason and faith. Its streets were to be drawn in perfect order, as if geometry itself had become divine law. For Alexander believed that order was the language of the cosmos, and to live within that harmony was to live forever. He would not live to see it built. Fate, ever jealous of dreamers, claimed him before the first stone was set. Yet the dream did not die. Like a seed cast into fertile earth, it took root in the minds of those who followed him. The architects, the philosophers, the kings who believed that thought could outlast the sword. Among them was Ptolemy, his general and friend, who became the first ruler of Egypt after Alexander's death. Ptolemy was not merely a man of war, but of wonder. He saw in his fallen leader's dream something divine, a city that could mirror the heavens, a place where every idea, every myth, every truth of man might find a home. He gathered builders, scholars, and sailors from across the sea. They arrived with the clatter of ships and tongues, Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, Persian, a chorus of civilization. From the quarries of Aswan came granite and marble. From Athens came artisans and thinkers. Together they raised temples to Isis and Serapis, theatres for poets, and academies for scholars. But more than stone, Alexandria was built of light. It was said that when the sun rose over the harbour, the white walls of the city caught fire, not with flame, but with brilliance. The sea reflected it back, until the horizon itself seemed to burn with thought. To walk through its streets was to feel civilization itself awakening. And yet beneath the beauty there was restlessness, a quiet, invisible yearning that haunted all great beginnings. For Alexandria was not content to be merely a city, it wanted to be eternal. And eternity demands a price. The people spoke of omens, of stars that refused to fade, of priests whispering that the gods had grown curious. Perhaps they sensed that something more than stone was being raised here, that this city would become a mirror for the mind of man, a mirror bright enough to dazzle even the gods themselves. In the evenings, as torches flickered along the harbour and the sea murmured against the docks, sailors from distant lands would tell stories that the city glowed even at night, as if the flame of knowledge had already been lit. They said its founder's ghost walked its avenues, tracing lines of invisible thought through marble and shadow. They were right in a way, for the true foundations of Alexandria were not laid in earth, but in the imagination. And once an idea is born, it cannot be buried. The city began to draw to itself the restless, the brilliant, the lost. Men and women who sought something greater than gold or glory. They came from Athens, Babylon, India, and Carthage. They brought with them languages, philosophies, fragments of forgotten gods. In their mingling, something new began to stir, a civilization of thought, not of conquest. The streets filled with the hum of debate, the scent of parchment, the clatter of styluses. Knowledge itself became the city's heartbeat. And from the harbour, where the waters met the horizon, rose the first silhouette of what would one day guide sailors through the dark. The lighthouse of Pharos, still unlit, but already imagined. It would be a symbol not of power, but of guidance, a reminder that light is only sacred when shared. Thus was Alexandria born, a city where empire became idea, and idea sought to touch the eternal. A city built not for gods, but for humanity's dream of becoming godlike. Through knowledge, through beauty, through remembrance. And though the centuries would one day turn that light to ash, and its stones to dust, the dream that began that morning by the sea would never truly die. For it was not made of marble or of empire, but of the oldest hunger in the human soul, the desire to know, and through knowing to live forever. When Alexander's body was carried back to Egypt, his dream did not die with him. Among those who had followed him through war and empire was Ptolemy, a man who had seen both the power and the fragility of conquest. He knew that empires are built on blood, but eternity belongs to thought. So he returned to the shores of the Nile, to the circle his king had drawn in the sand, and there he resolved to build not another empire of soldiers, but a kingdom of the mind. He gathered architects, poets, engineers, and astronomers, souls who spoke in different tongues, but who shared one hunger, to turn knowledge into immortality. They stood upon the harbour and watched the light of dawn touch the water. Here, Ptolemy said, would stand a city unlike any other, a place where man might converse with the universe. Its streets would follow the path of the sun. Its harbour would open toward the horizon. Its temples would not be built for gods, but for truth. Thus began the long labour of Alexandria. Stone was carved from the quarries of Egypt and shaped by Greek hands. Scribes and builders worked side by side, measuring the city not by cubits or steps, but by the rhythm of reason. In every design there was order, and in every order hope. When the first pillars rose, they gleamed like the bones of an idea finally given form. But Ptolemy's greatest dream was not the palace or the lighthouse. It was a house that could hold all the world's memory. A library. A temple not of worship but of wonder. He imagined halls filled with scrolls from every land, shelves reaching upward like prayers, each line of text another fragment of the divine mind. He sent ships to distant kingdoms, commanding that any scroll found in a foreign port be copied before it could pass beyond Alexandria's gaze. The sailors joked that the sea itself now belonged to the library, for every current brought with it new words. Soon the scrolls arrived, Egyptian hymns, Greek tragedies, Persian philosophies, Indian sutras, Babylonian maps of the stars. Each text was a world, and the library became their meeting place. Scholars worked day and night beneath oil lamps, their fingers black with ink, their breath fogging the parchment. They argued and translated, comparing truths like jewels held to the light. They believed, as Ptolemy believed, that knowledge was not divided by language or tribe. It was a single fire, seen through many flames. Within these walls, thought became sacred. The study of the heavens was an act of worship. Geometry was a way to glimpse divine order. To measure the stars was to measure the self. The Library of Alexandria was not a monument. It was a living mind, breathing through its scholars, dreaming through its scrolls. There were stories told of its keepers, men who could speak 10 languages, who could calculate the circumference of the earth from the shadow of a pillar, women who charted the movement of planets and wrote their names in the margins of history. They did not seek fame or gold. They sought clarity, the pure moment when understanding touches silence. Outside, the city grew around them. Merchants sold spices beside mathematicians. Fishermen recited poetry on the docks. The air itself seemed filled with debate. Philosophers argued beneath the colonnades, while children traced circles in the dust, imitating Euclid. In Alexandria, even the marketplace spoke the language of ideas. And on the island of Pharos, the great lighthouse began to rise. It was built to guide sailors, but also to stand as a symbol, a tower of flame to mirror the fire burning in the library's heart. At night, its light reached far across the sea, and travellers said it seemed less a beacon than a promise, that somewhere beyond the dark, the world was thinking. For a moment in history, it seemed mankind had found balance, a city where faith and reason walked together, where every question was a prayer, and every answer a new beginning. The dream that began with Alexander had become real, carried by Ptolemy's hands and the restless devotion of countless souls. But even here, in this city of light, there lingered a shadow. For where knowledge grows, so too does power, and power always calls to envy. The library's influence reached kings and empires. Its ideas began to move faster than armies. And though the flame of learning burned bright, those who watched from afar began to fear what light might reveal. Still, within those marble halls, the scholars laboured, unaware of what history would demand. They believed that if a man could know enough, he could be free. They believed that thought could conquer time. They believed, as all dreamers do, that what they built would last forever. For now, Alexandria stood radiant, a city built upon the fragile faith that knowledge itself could save mankind. And in that brief golden age, before the first embers began to stir, it did. Morning came softly to Alexandria. The first light broke over the sea, scattering gold across marble rooftops and white sails. From the harbour, the voices of traders rose with the cries of gulls, Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Aramaic, all blending into the living rhythm of a city that had become an idea. The dream Alexander had drawn in the sand was now breathing through thousands of hearts. At the edge of the water, the lighthouse of Pharos rose like a promise. Stone upon stone, it climbed toward the sky, built by hands that believed light could be crafted from labour. When its flame was lit, the whole harbour glowed. Sailors far from shore said they could see it burning even through the fog. A tower not only to guide ships, but to remind the world that reason, too, could shine. Within the city's heart, another fire burned. Quieter, but endless. The library of Alexandria had begun to fill with the voices of the earth. Every scroll that arrived was a world unfolding. Egyptian hymns, Greek philosophy, Indian sutras, Babylonian maps of the stars. The halls smelled of papyrus, cedar, and oil. Scholars moved through corridors like keepers of a sacred flame. To them, knowledge was not merely power, it was devotion. Learning was no longer the task of the few. It spilled into streets and markets. Children repeated the riddles of philosophers as games. Sailors learned constellations from astronomers who charted the heavens by night. Craftsmen debated ethics beside poets. Even silence in Alexandria seemed filled with thought. To learn here was to worship through understanding, to touch the divine through curiosity. At dusk, when the sun sank into the horizon, the lighthouse answered it, one fire giving birth to another. To travellers on the sea, it appeared as if the sun itself had descended into the tower. 2 flames burned now, the dying light of heaven and the living light of man. The city stood between them, a bridge of thought suspended between eternity and dust. But even light cast shadows. As the library's fame spread, so did fear. Priests whispered that the scholars were meddling with sacred mysteries. Some said they sought to uncover the language of the gods, others that they worshipped knowledge itself. Yet within those marble walls, the scribes continued their patient work. They believed that truth belonged to no temple, no empire, no faith, that it existed for its own sake, eternal and indivisible. Night after night, the library glowed with lamplight. From the sea, it looked as though the city had caught fire from within. Ships passing by would slow their oars, watching in silence, as if afraid to disturb a miracle. Inside, philosophers debated the shape of the universe. Mathematicians drew circles in the sand. Poets tried to give words to the stars. Each believed that to understand creation was to take part in it. There were moments when the entire city seemed to breathe as one, the hum of thought rising like a tide. The people believed that by gathering the world's wisdom, they could hold back the darkness of time. They had built monuments not to kings, but to questions. For a moment in history, humanity stood unafraid before the unknown. From the terrace of the library, one could see the beam of Pharos sweeping across the waves. It was said that its light could reach the edge of the world. To those who stood beneath it, it seemed less a flame than a heartbeat, the pulse of an age that had discovered its own mind. And so, under the twin fires of sea and sky, Alexandria entered its first golden age. The city had become a mirror for all that was human: wonder, ambition, doubt, and the longing to know. It did not yet see the storms gathering beyond the horizon. For now, the light was enough. For a brief span of centuries, the world believed that knowledge could save it. And perhaps, in that moment, it did. They spoke of it, as a temple, though no god had been chosen for its altars. The library was born from a different liturgy, a ritual of ink and patience, a public vow to remember. Under Ptolemy's hand, the city gave itself a great room to hold the world's voice. Corridors like lungs, galleries like rivers of stone, shelves arranged with the care with which a priest arranges sacred relics. It was a building that promised continuity in a world that forgot quickly. Ships came into the harbour bearing more than cargo. Wrapped in oilcloth and clay, bundles of scrolls arrived from the mouths of rivers and the mouths of strangers. Hymns from Memphis, star lists from Babylon, sutras whispered from distant India, plays and histories from the Greek Isles. Each package was received with ceremony, unrolled on long tables under lamps, read aloud, judged for accuracy, and then entrusted to copyists whose hands learned to make immortality one careful line at a time. To bring a text to Alexandria was to offer a shard of time. To copy it, there was to give it a second life. Royal decrees commanded that manuscripts passing through Alexandria be copied. Sometimes originals were kept, sometimes returned with courteous markings. Barges were sent up the Nile to trade for papyrus. Scribes were granted stipends and status. The exchange became systematic. Knowledge in, knowledge out, corrections appended, conjectures noted, commentaries layered like strata. The library did not merely hoard words, it curated a living record, a network of references that could be navigated like waterways. Inside the halls, learning wore a public face. The act of study was performed in courtyards and porticos where passers-by could pause and listen. A scholar would read aloud a passage and then yield the floor to a potter or a ship's captain. Questions would spring from unexpected mouths. Mathematics conversed with music. Medicine borrowed terms from poetry. Knowledge became social in Alexandria, a civic craft as ordinary as bread-making, as necessary as the supply of grain. The keepers of the library were chosen as carefully as the texts. They were polyglots and wanderers, men and women who could coax meaning from obscure script, who knew when a marginal note mattered more than a line of text. Some kept catalogues as though they were maps of the mind. Others slipped into foreign markets to buy fragments and bribe sailors for lost scrolls. Their work was liturgical and bureaucratic. Inventories maintained, exchanges negotiated, fragile scrolls pressed, bindings repaired. In their hands, the archive became an organism that required attention, diet, and care. Copyists worked with a devotion that was almost religious. By lamplight they transcribed, erred, corrected, annotated. Each copied line carried echoes of its maker. Tiny marginalia, a careful flourish, a translator's hesitation. To copy was to join a conversation across time. To gloss a phrase was to point a future reader toward a fork in interpretation. They believed that by reproducing words, they could postpone the oblivion that time demanded. The library's authority was not neutral. To gather the world's writings was to shape collective memory, and memory answers power. Envoys arrived with gifts, rulers sent rare volumes, and the keepers learned to perform a difficult balance between openness and protection. At times, politics strained the project, a passage suppressed, a patron's commentary elevated, a scholar silenced by the force of courtly favour, yet the institution itself tended to resist enclosure. Its culture nudged rulers toward respect, if not full deference. Perhaps the library's most fundamental achievement was cultural. It taught a practice of attention. citizens learned the etiquette of listening, how to let astonishment arrive before judgment, how to translate another tongue not merely into words but into habit. Children were trained to name things carefully. Merchants traded in references. Even sailors memorized star lists as if they were hymns for navigation. At dusk, the lamps in the library burned low while the city outside carried on. Yet within those galleries, the world's voices kept company. Arguments rose and settled. New notes were added to old treatises. Mistakes were discovered and corrected. Ideas were muffled and then reborn by the hands that tended them. The House of All Words did more than store knowledge. It taught how to live with it, how to sustain it. And in that patience lay the library's true miracle. A conviction that speech could be made durable, that human thought could be stitched into a fabric strong enough to cross generations. The House of All Words became a promise spoken aloud. We will not let the world forget. The library did not simply gather words, it translated them into understanding. Every scroll that arrived was an invitation to listen, to turn the noise of the world into harmony. In its halls, languages met like rivers merging into one sea. Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, Sanskrit. Voices once divided by distance now breathed the same air. Scholars believed that truth was not bound to any tongue. It lived between them, in the space where translation forced minds to think anew. Each morning, the scribes began their work as priests once began prayer. They unrolled papyrus as carefully as one would unwrap a relic. Beside them sat translators with sharpened reeds and patient eyes, men and women who weighed every word as though the fate of reason hung upon it. To find the right phrase was to glimpse the order hidden in the cosmos, and in that slow, meticulous labour, they began to speak a language older than speech, the language of understanding itself. Astronomers climbed to the roofs at night, mapping stars with tools of copper and string. They traced patterns unseen by older civilizations, realizing that the heavens obeyed laws, not whims. Mathematicians spoke of numbers as sacred instruments. The same rhythm that guided planets guided thought. Physicians, observing bodies with quiet awe, began to see the human form not as clay shaped by gods, but as a design that could be studied and healed. And yet these discoveries did not kill faith. They transfigured it. For in studying the structure of the universe, the scholars found something divine still pulsing beneath it. The symmetry of geometry, the pulse of the heart, the orbits of stars, all seemed to echo a hidden order, a vast intelligence written not in scripture, but in pattern. To know the world was not to strip it of wonder, but to reveal the wonder already there. Within these walls, philosophy and science ceased to be enemies. They became two lenses of the same vision. The mathematician sought truth in number, the poet in metaphor, the mystic in silence. Together they formed a choir that spoke with many voices but one intention: to make sense of being alive. The library was not a fortress of intellect. It was a cathedral of questions, open to all who entered with humility. In the afternoons, the courtyards filled with debate. Philosophers argued beneath the shade of fig trees. Students copied diagrams in dust. One could pass from astronomy to theology in a few steps, from the orbit of planets to the orbit of the soul. Every idea cast its reflection upon another. The scholars began to sense that truth was not a line, but a circle, An endless conversation in which every answer became a new beginning. As the city absorbed this way of thinking, Alexandria itself began to speak the library's language. Merchants counted in ratios rather than guesswork. Builders aligned walls to the sun's path. Sailors steered by mathematics rather than myth. The principles discovered in the library seeped into daily life, turning knowledge into custom. For the first time, civilization began to think as a single mind. But this unity carried danger. The library's light drew admiration and envy. The more clearly it spoke the language of the universe, the more it unsettled those who lived by the language of power. Priests murmured that the scholars had trespassed too far, that they dared to read what only the divine should read. Some rulers, dazzled by Alexandria's brilliance, began to fear it. For knowledge, once freed, obeys no master. Still, the scribes continued their work, unaware of how fragile their world was. They believed that if they could name every star, trace every law, preserve every word, they might build a bridge strong enough to cross eternity. They believed that reason itself could save mankind. And perhaps, for a moment, it did. For in that brief age, humanity learned to see its reflection in the heavens, not as the centre of creation, but as part of its vast design. The library gave the world a new language, one that even silence could understand. It was the language of the universe. And for a little while, Alexandria spoke it fluently. By the time the library reached its height, Alexandria had begun to think of knowledge as a living thing. It moved through the streets like wind, invisible but felt by all. The scholars called it pneuma, the breath of understanding, a spirit that passed from one mind to another. To learn was no longer an act of possession, but of transformation. Whoever entered the library didn't leave unchanged. The scrolls filled every wall now, so many that new buildings had to be raised to contain them. Entire wings were devoted to particular subjects: stars, geometry, medicine, the histories of vanished kingdoms. The air was thick with dust and ink, sweet with oil and cedar. The soft rustle of parchment became the city's heartbeat. Even the silence of the library seemed alive, like a pause between thoughts, waiting to be spoken. But as its halls filled with words, a subtle danger grew. Knowledge, once humble, began to look inward, to study itself. Scholars debated not only what was true, but who had the right to declare it. Authority shifted from kings and priests to those who could reason best. And reason is a crown that fits few without pride. Some began to whisper that the library had become a new kind of temple, one with no gods but countless priests. In the evenings, when the harbour lights flickered and the lighthouse cast its beam across the sea, the scholars would gather in the inner court. There they spoke of the soul, of matter, of the nature of light itself. Could thought exist without a thinker? Could creation be eternal? They questioned everything, even their own existence. It was said that a man could enter the library certain of his faith and leave unsure of his own name. And yet, in that doubt, a new kind of faith was born, faith in the mind itself. They began to see thought as sacred, curiosity as prayer. The pursuit of truth became its own devotion, and the search for understanding replaced worship. What once belonged to heaven now belonged to the intellect. Man had begun to build his own ladder to the divine. The oldest priests watched with unease. To them, this fire of inquiry looked too much like rebellion. There are things, they warned, that should remain mystery. but mystery had lost its fear in Alexandria. For every boundary that tradition raised, the scholars crossed another line, lit another lamp, drew another map. They believed that to hide knowledge was to betray it, that darkness itself was a kind of sin. Still, the brighter the flame burned, the longer its shadow stretched. Rivalries formed between philosophers. Schools turned into factions. The same passion that once united the seekers now began to divide them. Every theory demanded allegiance. Debates turned to feuds, and feuds to silence. The fire in the mind, once pure, began to consume itself. Yet even in conflict, beauty remained. Under moonlight, the library's terraces glowed pale gold. From its steps one could see the reflection of Pharos in the sea, a second sun trembling upon the waves. Sailors at night said that the city seemed to float between two worlds, one of fire, one of thought. Within those walls, humanity touched a kind of perfection, fragile, fleeting, but real. Some said the library's greatness was a gift from the gods. Others said it was theft. For to know the secrets of nature was to rival creation itself. The scholars did not answer. They had learned that every answer carried its own question, and so they kept writing, copying, questioning, as if by understanding everything they might earn forgiveness for their daring. They could not know what awaited them, the wars, the fire, the silence to come. For now they lived within their miracle, believing that light could last forever. They did not yet see that every flame, no matter how bright, is only borrowed from the dark. The library stood at its peak, radiant, restless, infinite, a mirror in which the world saw both its wisdom and its pride. And in that mirror, for one trembling instant, mankind looked at its own reflection and mistook it for God. They were not kings or soldiers, yet the fate of empires rested in their hands. The scribes of Alexandria, pale from lamplight marked by ink, lived their lives in quiet devotion to memory. They did not build monuments of stone. Their temples were made of words. Each morning they entered the library as others entered sanctuaries. The unrolling of a scroll was their prayer, the steady rhythm of the stylus their hymn. They were the priests of time, keepers of everything the world refused to forget. Some copied old texts, others translated new ones, and a few, the boldest, wrote their own. They came from many lands, Greece, Syria, Egypt, Persia. Each spoke with a different accent, yet all shared the same silence, the stillness of minds listening for truth. Their day began before dawn. The air was cool, thick with the scent of oil and papyrus. The first sound was always the same, a reed pen scraping across parchment. It was the heartbeat of Alexandria. Line after line, curve after curve, they laboured to preserve voices long gone. Philosophers, kings, poets, prophets. A mistake could mean the loss of a thought forever. And so they worked slowly, reverently, as though each letter contained the breath of a god. To copy was not a simple task. It was an act of resurrection. The words they wrote were centuries old, yet through their hands they became alive again. A good scribe didn't merely imitate the original. He listened to it. He allowed the text to pass through him like light through glass. And when the ink dried, something of his own soul remained inside it. Thus, every manuscript bore two spirits, the one who first conceived it and the one who preserved it. In the library's upper chambers, scholars and scribes often worked together. The scholars searched for meaning. The scribes ensured its survival. One without the other would have been blind. Philosophers debated theories, but it was the scribes who granted those debates eternity. Some said that without them, thought itself would vanish each generation, like smoke in the wind. Among them walked legends. Eratosthenes, who measured the earth with nothing but shadows and reason. Callimachus, the poet who catalogued the entire library, giving every scroll its place in the vast labyrinth of knowledge. Euclid, who revealed the hidden architecture of the universe through geometry. Their discoveries were not accidents of genius, but the result of relentless attention. The discipline to look closer, to listen longer, to think again. When the city outside grew loud, they retreated deeper into the halls. There, the world dissolved into parchment and light. Some said that a true scribe could hear the words before he wrote them, as if memory itself whispered. They believed that language was eternal, that to lose a word was to wound the universe. For them, to write was to heal. The scribes had few possessions. A reed pen, a knife for trimming it, a small lamp, a block of wax, a cup of water. They lived simply, ate modestly, and measured their wealth in lines completed. The library gave them purpose, and they gave it time, the one currency that could not be reclaimed. Many grew old at their desks, their eyesight fading, their hands trembling. Yet they continued until their last day, leaving behind not children or estates, but legacies written in ink. Visitors sometimes found them strange, these quiet figures hunched over tables, mouths moving silently as they traced another's thoughts. But those who stayed long enough understood. The scribes were not merely copying words, they were preserving the soul of humanity. In every scroll they finished, the past spoke to the future. The living and the dead shared breath. At night, when their work was done, they would step outside into the cool air of the courtyard. The lighthouse's flame burned across the water, reflected in their eyes. They would stand for a moment in silence, their hands stained black with ink, their faces illuminated by the glow. And in that brief stillness, they could feel it, the fire they tended each day, the fire of knowledge flickering within them. They knew it might not last forever. Empires fall, kings die, temples crumble. But what they had written could travel through time, carried by hands yet unborn. And perhaps one day, when even Alexandria was dust, their words would rise again, the eternal voice of a city that refused to vanish. For in every letter they wrote, the scribes of Alexandria whispered the same vow: we will not let the light go out. She walked the library like someone returning to a house she had once dreamt in. Hypatia moved through columns and courtyards with a calm that made even loud voices bend toward her. She was both scholar and teacher, a rare spirit who read the heavens as if they were a book written in a patient hand. Where others saw chaos in the night, she traced rhythms, circles nested in circles, the music of spheres revealed in quiet calculation. Born of Alexandria's mingled blood, she carried within her the city's contradictions. Greek thought braided to Egyptian ritual. Scientific hunger tempered by the poetry of the Nile. She taught geometry as one might teach a prayer, and astronomy as one might teach mercy. Students gathered at her feet, men and women who came from distant coasts to learn the methods that made the invisible visible. She insisted on clarity. A theorem should be as readable as a hymn. An orbit should be as gentle as a breath. Hypatia's reputation was not merely skill, but example. She walked barefoot into disputes, and by speaking simply, she revealed complexity without intimidation. Her lectures drew magistrates and fishermen, merchants and philosophers. She wrote no books that would survive the ages under her name, yet her influence threaded outward through the minds she shaped, like constellations tying strangers into one map. Her mind moved between disciplines as if they were rooms of the same house. She repaired instruments, adjusted the sightlines of astrolabes, and advised on calendars with the same care she gave to ethical paradoxes. To her, mathematics was not an end, but a way of seeing, precise language for the universe's subtle grammar. When a pupil despaired before an intractable problem, she would smile and say that patience was the true theorem. That truth often required the slow hours of attention, not the sudden glare of cleverness. This life of lucid devotion made her luminous and vulnerable. In a city where faith and reason often stood in uneasy embrace, Hypatia's clarity could be read as threat. Her presence became a mirror for those who feared change. Rival factions, hungry for authority and frightened by a woman's intellect, began to whisper that knowledge had become a rival god. Yet she did not withdraw. She walked among the people, listening to their stories, learning how thought might be married to mercy. She tended students like a gardener tends vines. Under her guidance, the city's curiosity bore fruit that would be eaten long after her name faded. Hypatia's gift was to make thinking generous, to insist that a mind's excellence is measured by its capacity to return its gains to the common life. There were nights when she stood upon the library terrace and watched the lighthouse sweep its beam across the dark. The light on Pharos and the thought in the library met in the sea's reflection. Both guided sailors and souls, one by sight and the other by reason. She would trace with a finger the arc of some distant planet, and in that arc read not only movement but meaning, the idea that human attention could tune itself to the larger order. As creeds hardened and rulers sought conformity, Hypatia's refusal to trade inquiry for obedience made her a target. Those who preferred the blunt instrument of outrage to the slow tool of argument found in her an inconvenient exemplar. In the end, it was not her intellect alone that sealed her fate, but the fear she awakened in those who equated power with certainty. Her death was brutal and public, meant to warn that reason had no sanctuary left. Yet violence forgets quickly. The habits she taught, to question kindly, to measure, to be precise without cruelty, outlived her. Ideas, once practiced widely, do not die with the body that taught them. Even as the library's corridors grew heavy with silence, her example remained. Men and women who had learned to listen kept her methods alive. Beyond Alexandria, in small gatherings of thinkers and healers, her memory became a kind of compass, proof that courage can take the shape of calm attention. The woman who read the stars became, after her death, a constellation herself, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge can be both luminous and humane. She showed the city a way to be more than fortress or faith, a community that made thought a shared labour. And for those who continued that labour, the stars never truly went out. In the hush that followed Hypatia's death, the library seemed to breathe differently. The familiar murmur of debate softened. The scratching of pens grew hesitant, as if the air itself had become cautious. Yet the scholars did not stop. They knew that silence, too, could be a form of surrender, and so they continued their work with a quieter determination. The flame still burned, but now it flickered, aware of the winds gathering beyond its walls. Among the remaining philosophers, a new question emerged, one that divided even old friends. They asked whether truth belonged to heaven or to man, whether knowledge was a gift from the divine or an invention born of curiosity. Some said that to study the stars was to read God's handwriting. Others answered that reason needed no author. Between them stretched a tension that could never be resolved, the eternal pull between reverence and independence. The library became the stage for this argument. Beneath its vaulted ceilings, metaphysics mingled with mathematics. In one chamber, scholars spoke of divine order. In another, skeptics mapped the limits of faith. The debates were fierce but disciplined. Every argument demanded evidence, and every claim was tested against experience. For a time, this method seemed to hold the city together, as if the act of questioning itself were the last sacred ritual Alexandria could agree upon. They studied the hidden properties of numbers, believing that within their harmony lay the echo of creation. To some, geometry was holy because it described perfection. To others, it was holy because it belonged to no one. Astronomers charted the sky, calling each new discovery another name for God. Even the skeptics, in denying the divine, were unknowingly tracing its outline. What united them all was not certainty, but wonder. In the evenings, the scholars gathered in the courtyard, where the light from the lighthouse trembled across the marble. They read from Plato and Aristotle, from the Hebrew prophets and Persian mystics. They sought patterns between their words, correspondences that hinted at a single idea expressed in 1,000 tongues. They believed that the divine could not be contained in one faith, that it moved like wind through different syllables. The secret names of God, they said, were scattered across the world, hidden in every language that ever dared to speak of truth. But outside the library, patience was running thin. The city's mood had shifted. The age of conversation was giving way to the age of decree. Bishops and generals began to compete for authority. Faith hardened into doctrine, and doctrine feared ambiguity. The scholars' tolerance for uncertainty, once the city's pride, was now its crime. What had been curiosity began to look like rebellion. Still, they gathered each morning to read. They spoke softly, no longer to persuade the world, but to keep the rhythm of thought alive. A few hid manuscripts within false walls, fearing what might come. Others sent copies north, to Athens, to Antioch, to far monasteries beyond the desert. They had learned from Hypatia's fate that ideas could not be defended with force, only with persistence. Sometimes at dusk, when the streets outside echoed with chants of faith, a scholar would climb to the roof of the library and watch the beam of Pharos cut through a mist. The sea was black, the air sharp with salt, and the light seemed to falter before finding itself again. He would whisper to no one, "Perhaps even this is divine," this act of endurance, this refusal to yield to darkness. The library had become both sanctuary and warning. Within its walls burned the last calm light of an age that believed in the mind's ability to rise toward meaning. Outside, the noise of certainty was growing louder. Yet the scholars continued to write, to copy, to translate. They believed that if even one word survived, it would carry within it the memory of all the rest. In those final years, they spoke less of systems and more of essence, less of heaven as a place, more as a condition reached through thought. The line between faith and reason blurred until neither could be separated from the other. It was said that a single sentence written in those days could make believers pause and doubters pray. When the last of the old philosophers left the library, he turned once to look at the building's shadow stretching over the water. The air smelled of oil and dust, of knowledge too long confined. He whispered the ancient vow of the scribes, not to any god, but to the idea that truth, whatever its name, must not be forgotten. And as he walked away, the light of Pharos swept once across the marble facade, catching for an instant on the bronze doors. It was enough to make the building shine, not as monument, but as memory. The fire of thought still lived within, fragile but unextinguished, guarding the secret names of God. For the first time in history, the world began to speak to itself. Ships from every known shore sailed toward Alexandria, their sails white against the endless blue, carrying spices, silk, maps, and manuscripts. On the docks, sailors from Carthage argued with philosophers from Athens. Priests from Judea traded parables with scholars from India. The library had become more than a place of learning. It was the beating heart of a new kind of empire, one not ruled by armies, but by ideas. Knowledge flowed outward from Alexandria like the Nile at its flood. Translations of Greek philosophy reached distant temples in Babylon. Egyptian mathematics guided the architects of new cities. The teachings of Indian medicine mingled with theories of the human spirit brought from Persia. For the first time, thought began to move faster than conquest, and in that movement, humanity discovered a strange new unity, one not of blood or flag, but of curiosity. Within the library, the scholars sensed this change. They began to see themselves as custodians of a shared inheritance. Their task was no longer to guard their own culture, but to translate the soul of one civilization into the language of another. A text copied in Alexandria might travel to Athens, be rewritten in Antioch, carried by merchants to Carthage, and return years later transformed. A conversation without end. The library became less a building than a rhythm, the circulation of memory. In the lecture halls, the old barriers between nations dissolved. A philosopher quoted a Babylonian prayer to explain a theorem. A poet used geometry to shape his verse. No idea was too sacred to be tested, and no question too dangerous to be asked. To think freely was not rebellion. It was citizenship. The scholars believed that the universe itself demanded interpretation, and that in every pattern lay a fragment of its meaning. Outside its walls, Alexandria mirrored this harmony. Merchants in the marketplace debated philosophy between transactions. Fishermen marked the tides according to lunar charts drawn by astronomers. The city was not divided into sacred and profane. It was a single body, animated by thought. Even the architecture seemed to echo reason. Streets arranged like a diagram, towers like exclamation marks, the great lighthouse like an idea turned to flame. It was a time of rare equilibrium. Faith, reason, and imagination walked side by side, their differences not yet turned to weapons. The world seemed, for a moment, to move in a single direction, toward light. And those who lived within it believed that they were standing at the summit of time, that no darkness could ever fall again. Yet within this harmony lay the seeds of its undoing. For where ideas travel freely, they cannot be owned. Kings grew uneasy as their decrees were questioned. Priests felt their altars tremble beneath the weight of reason. In Alexandria's streets, debates once spirited became accusations. The same bridges that carried knowledge began to carry doubt. The scholars felt the change before they could name it. There was a restlessness in the air, a subtle shift from wonder to ambition. Some began to seek not understanding, but mastery, the power to command nature, to shape the future. What had once been devotion to truth became hunger for discovery without conscience. The fire in the mind brightened, and with it, its shadow. Still, the city's faith in knowledge endured. On the harbour's edge, the lighthouse kept its silent vigil, its beam sweeping across the dark like a heartbeat. To those who watched from the sea, it seemed that Alexandria itself was alive, a creature made of marble and light, thinking through its people, dreaming through its scholars. And, for a time, that dream held. The world, vast and many-tongued, had found a way to speak as one. The empires of land and sea had given way to an empire of ideas, fragile, luminous, and free. But all light, once born, carries its own dusk. And as Alexandria shone brightest, the horizon began to darken. At its height, Alexandria felt eternal. The city glimmered beneath the Mediterranean sun, like a jewel balanced between worlds. Its harbour was a forest of masts, its streets rivers of voices. The library breathed, the lighthouse burned, and the air itself seemed charged with meaning. To live here was to stand inside the promise of civilization, a place where wisdom had finally triumphed over war. Yet beneath the brilliance there was unease. The world beyond Alexandria's walls still bent to the will of emperors. Rome had risen, and its shadow reached farther each year. Soldiers spoke in the markets, governors sat in marble courtyards, and laws written in Latin began to echo through Greek colonnades. The empire admired the city's knowledge, but it admired order more. In every age, power learned to borrow the symbols of enlightenment while fearing its substance. The scholars at first ignored these tremors. They believed that truth, once known, could not be undone. Their faith was not in armies or borders, but in permanence. The idea that reason, once awakened, could never again be put to sleep. They did not yet understand how fragile that faith was, how easily knowledge could be drowned beneath the noise of command. In the lecture halls, the debates continued. Philosophers still argued about the soul and the stars, but something in their tone had changed. Their questions had grown defensive. They spoke less to discover and more to defend. Doubt, the city's oldest virtue, began to feel dangerous. A new generation of rulers and priests preferred certainty, and certainty has always been the enemy of thought. In the taverns and workshops, whispers began to spread. Some said the library kept forbidden texts, writings that mocked the gods or defied the empire. Others claimed its scholars were magicians, using numbers to conjure spirits, turning learning into heresy. The same people who once celebrated the library's miracles now began to fear them. What had been light started to look like fire. Still, the flame endured. By night, lamps burned in the windows of the museum. Shadows of scholars moved across the glass like ghosts. They worked quietly, knowing their peace would not last. They could feel the future leaning toward them, the heavy tread of soldiers, the clamour of belief rising against reason. Yet they continued, as they always had, because the work itself was their defiance. Outside, Rome's grip tightened. The empire demanded loyalty, not insight. The governors who once attended lectures now sent taxes and edicts instead. The library's scholars were tolerated but watched. The old dream of unity, of a world joined by understanding, began to fracture. Knowledge, once a shared inheritance, became a guarded treasure again. And yet, within the city's fading harmony, there were moments of grace. A mathematician proved a theorem by candlelight, smiling as if nothing beyond his paper existed. A poet whispered verses in the language of two nations and made them sound like one. A young student, reading by the harbour, lifted her eyes to the horizon and imagined a future where these ideas might still live. It was fragile, yes, but it was still beautiful. The philosophers began to speak of balance, of how every creation carries the seed of its undoing. They taught that wisdom must renew itself like the tide, retreating to return stronger. But few listened. The city had grown proud. It believed itself immune to time. The lighthouse still blazed, and so long as its fire burned, who could imagine darkness? But even the brightest flame casts its longest shadow before it fades. The streets grew louder, the harbour heavier with ships of war, and far away beyond the calm blue line of the sea, forces gathered that neither logic nor beauty could dissuade. For centuries, Alexandria had lived as a dream of unity, a fragile paradise held together by thought. But no dream, however luminous, can resist the waking world forever. The questions that once joined mankind now began to divide it. And in that division, the first cracks appeared in the empire of ideas. The first signs came quietly, not as thunder, but as a trembling in the air. Merchants arriving from the east spoke of unrest in the provinces, of temples plundered, libraries sealed, and new gods rising from the ruins of the old. Rome, once a patron of reason, was turning inward, its emperors seeking not truth, but survival. Beyond the Mediterranean, tides of faith and fear began to move in patterns the scholars could not chart. The age of conversation was ending, and an age of proclamation was drawing near. In Alexandria, the signs were felt like pressure before rain. Scribes noticed that certain manuscripts no longer returned from the palace archives. Philosophers began to choose their words more carefully, trimming away questions that might sound like defiance. The crowds in the markets grew restless, their talk sharpened by rumour. Priests, sensing the shifting wind, spoke more loudly than ever, promising salvation through obedience. The city still glittered, but beneath the marble lay the pulse of anxiety. The library tried to hold its calm. Within its walls, the old disciplines continued, the copying of scrolls, the slow deciphering of lost tongues, the endless search for pattern and order. But the scholars could feel the world tightening around them. When they spoke of balance or reason, their voices now carried the faint sound of defiance. Each argument was a risk, each discovery a provocation. The freedom that had once defined Alexandria was beginning to feel like a memory. A new kind of silence entered the library, not the reverent hush of study, but the watchful stillness of fear. Conversation stopped when soldiers passed by the gates. Certain topics vanished entirely. The motion of the stars, the nature of the soul, the question of creation. Ideas that had once been celebrated were now labelled dangerous. Some scholars left quietly, carrying with them fragments of the library's vast memory, scattering its light across distant lands. Others stayed, determined to protect what they could, even as the sky darkened above them. Outside, the world was changing shape. Empires were crumbling, faiths were hardening, and words once spoken in pursuit of truth were being turned into banners of war. The same curiosity that had once united nations was now being used to justify their conquest. The dream of a shared human mind, that fragile thread connecting all who sought to understand, began to fray. And yet, within the library's fading glow, a few refused despair. They whispered to one another in the old way, quietly, carefully, believing that if thought could not survive in the open, it might endure in secret. They wrote on smaller scraps of papyrus, hid them within walls, sent them with traders disguised as inventory. A handful of names began to vanish from the records, but their words found new readers far from the city. Even as the empire tightened its grasp, knowledge slipped through its fingers like sand. On some nights, the wind from the harbour carried the sound of distant thunder. The lighthouse stood firm against it, its beam sweeping the horizon like an unblinking eye. But the scholars who looked upon it knew. Storms were coming, not of weather but of will. They could already feel history gathering its breath. A philosopher wrote in those days, "Every civilization builds a fire, and every fire leaves its ash. The question is not whether the flame will die, but what will rise from its embers." His words passed quietly among the scribes, copied in secret, carried in memory. They understood that Alexandria was nearing its test, that the light which had guided the world would soon be asked to prove whether it could survive the dark. And so, the library waited. Its walls still gleamed in the sun. Its scholars still spoke softly beneath the arches. But every sound carried the weight of what was coming. The city that once taught humanity to listen was now straining to hear its own heartbeat beneath the gathering storm. Far beyond the harbour, lightning touched the horizon. The winds shifted, and the first whispers of the fire to come began to move through the marble halls of Alexandria. The city had known storms before, tempests from the sea, uprisings from within, but none like this. The year was 48 BCE, and Rome's shadow had fallen over Alexandria. Caesar had come, chasing Pompey's ghost across the sands of Egypt, and the world's most brilliant city found itself caught between empires. The harbour was choked with ships. Siege engines lined the quays. The smell of tar and salt filled the air. Soldiers from every corner of Rome moved through the streets like a tide, their armour glinting beneath a sun that seemed too bright for war. The citizens watched from doorways, whispering prayers to gods who no longer answered. Above them, the lighthouse of Pharos burned as always, serene, indifferent, unaware that its reflection was about to be stained with smoke. Caesar, restless and surrounded, had taken refuge in the royal quarter, near the harbour and the great library itself. The city was divided between loyalties, some to the queen, Cleopatra, others to her brother and rival, Ptolemy Fafane. In the confusion, Alexandria, the mind of the ancient world, became a battlefield. The scholars felt the tremors first. The ground shook beneath the rumble of catapults, the crash of falling stone. From the library's terraces, they could see plumes of dust rising where the city walls met Rome's relentless order. They had heard rumours for weeks that Caesar's troops were cornered, that the Egyptian army would storm the harbour, that fire was being prepared as a weapon. But even then, few imagined that knowledge itself could be among the casualties. Inside the library, the scholars continued their routines as the city burned around them. They wrote, copied, debated, clinging to their rituals as if order itself might hold back chaos. "The war will pass," one said. "The words will remain." But outside, war has never respected words. When the fighting reached the docks, the library stood directly in its path. Caesar, desperate to break the siege, ordered his men to set fire to the enemy's ships. Hundreds of vessels moored in the harbour, loaded with supplies. The torches were lit, the wind strong. What began as strategy became catastrophe. The flames leapt from sail to sail, consuming the fleet in minutes. The heat was unbearable. The sky turned red. Sparks carried by the wind drifted across the waterfront, landing on warehouses, markets, and then on the library itself, that vast dry labyrinth of papyrus and oil. The scholars watched in horror as embers floated over the roof, glowing like small red omens. Still they hoped. "The fire will not reach us," said one. "The stones will hold." But paper burns faster than faith. The first spark found an open window. Inside, the air was dry as dust, the shelves packed tight with scrolls. A single flame, carried on the breath of war, touched the corner of a manuscript, and history caught fire. The smoke began to pour through the colonnades, black and thick. Outside, soldiers shouted, unaware of what they had unleashed. To them, it was victory. The enemy's ships destroyed, the siege broken. To the scholars, it was the sound of the world being rewritten in ash. By nightfall, the sky above Alexandria glowed like a forge. The lighthouse, that ancient symbol of human light, now looked across the water and saw its reflection burn. The sea shimmered red, the smoke rolling toward the stars. Some said that from a distance it looked like dawn, but it was not dawn. It was the first light of loss. Inside the library, chaos reigned. Men and women rushed through corridors carrying armfuls of scrolls, their faces lit by fire. Others tore manuscripts from shelves, trying to save what they could. The sound was a terrible symphony. The roar of flames, the crack of timber, the desperate cries of those who knew exactly what they were losing. Outside, the streets were filled with the smell of burning papyrus, sweet and sickening. Words written across centuries, languages that had bridged continents, vanished in the wind. The scholars could do nothing but watch. The fire spread faster than thought. By the time dawn broke, the Library of Alexandria, that sanctuary of civilization, was already becoming legend. The night came like a wound. The harbour glowed red beneath the wind, ships crackling as their masts bent and fell. The sea hissed where molten pitch met water. What began as Caesar's desperate order to burn the Egyptian fleet and break the siege had become something else entirely. The fire had escaped command. It had found the library. Inside, the first embers drifted through open windows, settling on shelves stacked with centuries of thought. The air was dry, thick with dust and oil. A spark landed, then another until the silence turned bright. For a moment no one moved. Then a single scroll caught, its flame thin as a whisper, and history began to burn. Panic followed swiftly. Scholars who had once debated calmly now ran through the corridors, arms full of manuscripts. Their robes brushed against walls already hot to the touch. Shelves toppled, smoke rolled low along the marble floors. The careful order that had defined the library, the quiet ritual of knowledge, dissolved into chaos. Outside, the sky was red and trembling. The lighthouse of Pharos stood distant and impassive, its great flame answering the smaller, angrier one that now devoured the city. From the harbour, the glow seemed almost beautiful. A second sunrise mirrored in the sea. But those who watched knew it was not dawn. It was an ending disguised as light. Scrolls burned in waves. The fire crawled across the shelves, feeding on papyrus, multiplying faster than breath. The air filled with the scent of ink and cedar and smoke. Letters melted into one another, words dissolving into colour. The scholars tried to fight it, beating at the flames with cloth, dragging buckets of water from the courtyard. But water turned to steam before it touched the walls. Some fled into the streets carrying what they could. Others refused to leave, unwilling to abandon the work of 1,000 minds. A woman threw a bundle of scrolls from a balcony into the wind, shouting, "Fly!" They scattered like white birds, then vanished into the fire. By midnight, the library was a single living flame. The columns glowed like molten gold. The roof collapsed inward with a roar. The heat was unbearable. Onlookers stood in silence, unable to decide whether they were witnessing destruction or sacrifice. One soldier crossed himself. Another whispered, "The gods are watching." Ash rained over the city. Fragments drifted through the streets. Torn scraps of poetry. Half a line of Euclid. A verse from a forgotten hymn. Yet the air shimmered with ghosts of meaning. To breathe was to inhale memory. The scholars gathered at the edge of the harbour, their faces lit by the inferno. None spoke. They watched as the fire consumed the heart of their world, the only language left to them the rhythm of the waves. A few knelt, a few prayed, most simply stared, as if trying to memorize the shape of loss. By dawn, the fire had spent itself. What remained was not silence, but exhaustion, a kind of stunned reverence. The library stood in ruin, its pillars blackened, its halls choked with ash. Between the stones, the first light of morning filtered through like mercy. The scholars moved among the debris, their hands grey, their eyes hollow. In the soot they found fragments, a corner of a map, a verse still legible, a page spared by wind. They gathered them gently, as if collecting the body of a friend. Every word saved was a victory against oblivion. When the sun rose fully, it revealed a city changed forever. The sea still smoked. The sky was pale with grief. The lighthouse watched from across the bay, its flame now the only light left in Alexandria. The world's greatest treasure had burned, yet even as the ashes cooled, the idea of it began to grow larger than the building had ever been. For the library was more than walls and scrolls. It was a promise that humanity could gather its thoughts and lift them toward eternity. The fire had broken the promise, but not the faith behind it. That faith, like smoke, would drift outward, carried by the wind, by memory, by longing. And so the library died, but its story began. Morning came without song. The sea was still, the sky a dull grey curtain stretched over the ruins. Where the library had stood, only smoke remained, thin and aimless, curling into air already tired of holding sorrow. The city, once a chorus of voices, had fallen into silence. Even the gulls refused to cry. Alexandria had awakened to the sound of its own absence. The streets were layered in ash. It clung to sandals, to skin, to the breath of anyone who passed. The smell of smoke lingered in every corner, a mixture of salt, ink, and something older, like burnt parchment and dreams. People moved quietly through the wreckage, their faces pale beneath the morning light. They did not yet understand what had vanished, only that the world had become lighter in the wrong way. At the harbour, The water reflected the ruin. Charred ships lay half sunk, their masts pointing accusingly toward the heavens. The lighthouse still burned, but its flame now seemed small, almost fragile. From its tower, a sentry looked down upon the city and thought it resembled the aftermath of a thought too bright to endure. Among the ruins, a few scholars wandered, their robes grey with soot. They searched through the wreckage with hands that trembled, lifting fragments that still bore letters. Half a word, the edge of a diagram, a faint line of poetry that had somehow survived the night. They gathered these relics into baskets as if they were sacred bones. Every scrap was a prayer. One man knelt in the rubble and traced the outline of a burned shelf, his finger moving through dust where scrolls had once stood like soldiers of light. He whispered the titles he remembered, names of poets, philosophers, mathematicians, as if speaking them aloud could bring them back. His voice broke halfway through the list. Still, he continued until the ash took his breath. Elsewhere, a woman found a single page, singed but legible. It held a fragment of verse from a lost play. When the gods fall silent, man must answer for himself. She read it aloud, her voice thin against the sea wind. Others nearby stopped to listen. The words floated above the ruins, fragile but alive. For a moment, it felt as though the library was speaking through her, reminding them that thought itself could not burn. By midday, the city began to move again. Fishermen repaired nets along the shore, merchants swept their stalls. Life, stubborn as always, returned. But something in Alexandria had changed. The citizens spoke more softly, as if every word carried the weight of those lost. Even laughter sounded cautious, aware of its own mortality. In the palace, Caesar looked out across the smoke and said nothing. To him, the library was collateral, a casualty of victory. He could not know that the world would remember this act longer than his conquests. Empires fall, but fire remembers. As night approached, the first stars appeared above the haze. Their light seemed older, gentler, as if offering a kind of apology. A few scholars lit small lamps among the ruins, keeping vigil where the great flame had died. They sat in silence, each thinking of the same impossible thing: how to rebuild what had no walls, how to restore what had been made of faith and paper and time. One of them, the youngest, spoke softly. "We cannot save what was written," he said, "but we can remember how it felt to write it." The others nodded. It was enough. Memory, after all, was another form of survival. And so, in the shadow of the ashes, Alexandria began again. The library was gone, but its ghost remained, not in buildings or scrolls, but in the stubborn act of remembering. Every lamp lit that night, every voice that dared to speak a word of wonder, was a fragment of the same flame reborn. The dawn that followed would not be golden. It would be grey, gentle and uncertain. But it would still be dawn. And from that fragile light, the idea of the library, wounded, scattered, immortal, would rise again. The city that once measured its nights by stars now learned to count its days by crosses. A new rhythm moved through Alexandria, not of argument and inquiry, but of prayer and procession. In the same streets where philosophers had debated the soul, choirs now sang of salvation. The sound was gentler, steadier, yet beneath its beauty lay a new kind of silence, the silence that comes when questions are no longer asked. At first it seemed a healing. The library was gone, the empire divided. People longed for meaning again. for something the fire could not destroy. Christianity offered that certainty, a promise that pain had purpose, that truth could be simple, that the soul had a home beyond reason. It spread quietly at first, through kindness, a shared loaf of bread, a whispered prayer, until the city itself began to change. Churches rose where lecture halls had stood. The smell of papyrus and ink gave way to incense and smoke. Statues of forgotten gods were draped in linen and carried away. Candles replaced oil lamps. Psalms replaced poetry. The city's memory began to glow with a different kind of light, steady, unwavering, absolute. The new creed brought compassion where the empire had brought law. It cared for the poor, fed the hungry, healed the broken. For the first time, mercy was not weakness but virtue. And yet, as it comforted, it also commanded. The bishop spoke with one voice, and expected that voice to be obeyed. Truth, once an endless horizon, became a border. The scriptures were declared complete, the mystery of God fixed. Curiosity, that dangerous spark, was recast as temptation. Still, not all light was lost. In monasteries beyond the city, monks laboured by candlelight, copying ancient texts in secret. Between their prayers, they preserved fragments of the old world, geometry, medicine, poetry. To study creation, one wrote, is to worship the Creator. Their cells became the library's last sanctuary, their silence its final echo. But in Alexandria itself, the change was profound. The schools of philosophy emptied. The Museion was closed by decree. The study of the heavens was called arrogance, the study of man, sin. Scholars trimmed their words to survive. Some turned their reason into theology. Others vanished into exile. Those who remained whispered forbidden thoughts to a dwindling circle of students. The last flickers of inquiry in a city gone still. The new faith carried a power Rome had never mastered. Not the power of armies, but of unity. Its reach stretched from the poorest homes to the emperor's court. Theology became law, doubt became crime. The library's ghost still wandered the streets, but its voice was drowned beneath hymns and bells. And yet, the transformation was not born of evil. The philosophers had sought freedom, the church, meaning. One worshipped the question, the other the answer. Both were born of the same longing, to make sense of the infinite. The first built the library, the second the altar. And somewhere between them, humanity searched for balance. Still, there were moments of grace between the walls of devotion. A priest paused mid-sermon to gaze at the morning sun through stained glass, whispering that perhaps the light itself was a scripture not yet read. A woman, once a scholar, taught her children letters by carving them on a clay jar, believing that the shape of knowledge was another form of prayer. And in quiet corners of the monasteries, monks debated the stars in hushed tones, fearful but unrepentant. The thirst for wonder did not die. It merely learned to speak softer. At dusk, the city looked peaceful. Candles flickered in doorways. Hymns floated across the harbour. Bells called the faithful to prayer. The same stars still shone above the domes, but few now looked upward to measure them. Instead they bowed their heads, not to seek the heavens, but to ask forgiveness from them. It was beautiful, this new devotion, and yet, beneath its glow, something delicate had vanished. The courage to say, "I do not know." The patience to live beside mystery rather than silence it. And so, beneath the candlelight and crosses, a new chapter began. Gentle, solemn, and still. Reason slept, but the heart kept vigil. And in that long night of faith, The flame of knowledge waited, not extinguished, only hidden, for the dawn that would one day wake it again. Morning came quietly to Alexandria. The streets shimmered in a haze of dust and light. Bells rang from church towers, calling the faithful to prayer. In the market square, incense hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of salt and seaweed from the harbour. Yet beneath the surface calm, something darker stirred. The pulse of fear, the heat of rumour. They said Hypatia had defied the will of God. They said she was a sorceress, a blasphemer, a woman who spoke too beautifully to be harmless. In truth, she was a philosopher, the last of the old kind, a teacher of mathematics, of astronomy, of the geometry of thought itself. She had lived her life in pursuit of clarity, believing that reason was a form of prayer, and that to understand creation was to honour its creator. In her lecture hall, students gathered from across the world. Christians, pagans, and skeptics alike sat together beneath the same light, listening as she spoke of the stars, of the movements of spheres invisible but real. Her hands traced circles in the air as if shaping the orbits of planets. To those who came to her, knowledge felt sacred again, a bridge between the visible and the divine. But Alexandria was no longer a city that trusted bridges. The age of tolerance was ending. Faith had grown hard around its edges. The patriarch Cyril had risen to power, brilliant, ruthless, convinced that truth needed no companions. Between the church and the old school of philosophy, there was now only suspicion. Each sermon against heresy became a spark, and the city was tinder. Hypatia lived in the midst of it, refusing to retreat. Her students warned her to leave, but she remained, dignified, calm, unwilling to abandon the dream of reason. Philosophy, she told them, must not be silent while ignorance shouts. Her courage was quiet, not defiant. The kind that comes from believing light can defend itself, but light in dark times becomes a target. One morning, as she rode her chariot through the streets, the crowd began to gather. Whispers turned to shouts. Shouts turned to stones. The mob surged forward, believers, citizens, men blinded by zeal. They tore her from her seat, dragged her into the Caesarium. Once a temple of reason, now a church. There, in the house of faith, they killed what remained of wisdom. No army intervened. No bishop called for mercy. The city that had built the library watched in silence as its last philosopher fell beneath its own devotion. The marble floor drank her blood. The echo of her cries mingled with the hymns rising from nearby chapels. It was said the sun dimmed that afternoon, as if unwilling to look upon what men had done in the name of heaven. Her students fled or hid. Some burned their notes before the soldiers could find them. Others carried what they could, fragments of Euclid, a scroll of Plato, a few lines of her own work, into exile. They said she died defending knowledge. But she had not fought, she had taught. Her only weapon had been clarity. The church called her death justice. The scholars called it madness. The truth lay somewhere between, in the terrible certainty that grips men when they believe they serve eternity. Hypatia became the symbol of a question that would haunt history. How can the love of God coexist with the fear of the mind he gave us? Days later, when the mob had dispersed and the city returned to its uneasy calm, the wind carried her name through the alleys. Not as curse, but as echo, students whispered it in foreign ports. Monks wrote it in the margins of forbidden books. Centuries later, her name would rise again like a spark that refused to die, a reminder that knowledge may fall silent, but it never forgets. And still, in the quiet that followed her death, something shifted in Alexandria. The city seemed smaller, emptied of its last question. The schools closed their doors, the debates ceased. Only the sound of prayer remained, solemn, endless, absolute. The flame of reason had gone out, and in its place devotion stood alone beneath the sky. Yet not all believed her death a failure. For in dying, she became a kind of scripture herself, the testament of inquiry. Her story travelled further than any sermon, her silence deeper than any chant. In every age that followed, those who sought truth remembered her name, as if she were still teaching through the wound she left behind. And when the night fell over Alexandria, and the wind moved through its broken courtyards, some said they could still hear the faint sound of chalk upon stone, the ghost of a woman tracing circles in the air, whispering the language of light. For even in death, Hypatia remained what she had always been, a flame, small, bright, and unafraid. Night had fallen over Alexandria. The sea was black glass, the streets empty, the air heavy with salt and sorrow. The city still whispered her name, Hypatia, though few dared to say it aloud. Her death had marked more than the end of a life. It had sealed an age. The voice of reason had gone silent, and the light of the mind had guttered out beneath the shadow of devotion. But even as the smoke of violence lingered, there were still those who would not let the last ember die. In the monasteries beyond the city walls, men worked by candlelight. They moved quietly through narrow halls lined with stone, their robes brushing the floor like the sound of wind in a graveyard. They spoke little, for silence was their discipline and their disguise. Their fingers, cracked from the cold, traced letters with the patience of prayer. For them, every word copied was an act of resistance, a vow that memory would not be surrendered to fire or faith. Scrolls lay before them, some half-burned, others salvaged from the wreckage of the old schools. The texts were worn, smudged, incomplete. But to those who wrote, they were holy. Aristotle's fragments, Galen's notes, the geometry of Euclid, works once debated in public squares, now hidden like contraband. They wrote on parchment and scraps of animal skin, binding them with thread and hope. Their Latin and Greek mixed with scripture. Philosophy now survived beneath psalms. One monk, young and sleepless, paused to stare at the flame of his candle. He wondered whether the world would ever need these words again, whether the age of wisdom was truly over. His elder, seeing his doubt, whispered, "We are not preserving books, we are preserving the courage to begin again." And the younger bowed his head and kept writing. The monasteries became the library reborn, smaller, humbler, hidden from power. Knowledge no longer lived in marble halls, but in whispers, in ink, in patience. It no longer dressed itself in pride. It survived in humility. The words that once commanded empires now existed only in the quiet turning of pages, in the rhythm of breathing, in the scratch of quills. Outside, the empire changed. Rome fell and rose again under new names. Faith hardened into doctrine, and wars were waged over words. The city that had birthed philosophers became a relic of saints. The great lighthouse still stood, but its beam fell upon waters that no longer carried scholars, only traders and pilgrims. The world, it seemed, had forgotten how to ask why. And yet, in the corners of that forgetting, memory worked in secret. A monk in Sinai copied Plato's dialogues beside the Gospels, believing both were prayers on different tongues. A scholar in Constantinople translated ancient texts into the language of empire. A physician in Syria studied anatomy through Galen's forbidden writings, whispering that the body was God's first scripture. The fragments travelled, carried in saddlebags, hidden in cathedrals, smuggled across deserts. In time, the scribes began to sense a strange truth, that the silence of faith was not entirely empty. It had become a womb, dark, enclosed, waiting. The old light had not died. It was gestating, preparing for rebirth. The candle that flickered in the monk's hands was the same flame that had once burned in the library's towers. Diminished, yes, but unbroken. One night, during a storm, lightning flashed across the monastery walls. The young monk lifted his eyes and imagined the sky as a vast page written in light. He thought of Hypatia, of the library, of all the voices lost to fire and zeal. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Perhaps God hides knowledge not to punish us, but to teach us to seek." The words vanished into thunder, but they would live on, passed from teacher to student across generations. As dawn came, the monks laid down their pens and closed the scrolls. The room was filled with the soft scent of wax and ink. Outside, rain washed over the stones, tracing small rivers through the dust. The elder walked to the window and looked toward the distant city. He could almost see the outline of the lighthouse against the grey horizon, the last witness of an age that refused to disappear. He whispered a prayer, not for salvation, but for remembrance, that one day, when the world was ready, these words would be found again, that the light, hidden now in parchment and silence, would rise once more to meet the dawn. And so, in the long night of faith, the last scrolls slept, not as relics, but as seeds. The library was gone, but its soul had learned a new form of survival. To hide, to wait, and to dream of the moment when humanity would once again dare to read the world aloud. The centuries turned like slow wheels of sand. Empires rose, burned, and crumbled into dust, their banners devoured by wind. The world that had once knelt before the brilliance of Alexandria now forgot its name. The harbour filled with silt, the marble of its streets cracked beneath the sun. The desert, patient and unhurried, began its work, not as destroyer, but as a razor. The library was gone, the temples had fallen silent. Yet the city lingered, half alive, a ruin wearing the memory of greatness. Traders still came from the east, sailors still sought its port, but the Alexandria they found was not the one sung of in history. Its lighthouses were dim, its scholars gone, its gods unnamed. What remained was stone, and the slow voice of the wind. The Arab armies came swiftly like a tide from the south. They brought not fire but faith. The banners of the caliphate fluttered above domes that had once crowned Greek philosophers. To them, the conquest was not destruction, but renewal, the victory of revelation over empire. The people, weary from centuries of rule and rebellion, yielded easily. Alexandria became a jewel of Islam, a gate between Africa and the East. Yet beneath the shimmer of new faith, the dust of the old world still stirred. The conquerors walked among ruins they barely understood. They saw pillars rising from the sand, statues half buried, inscriptions in languages no one could read. To some, these were curiosities. To others, warnings. They spoke of arrogance, of men who had worshipped their own minds instead of God. And so the memory of the library was retold as a fable, a monument to pride, a lesson in the futility of human reason. But not all forgot. Within the great libraries of Baghdad and Damascus, scholars whispered of the city by the sea where wisdom had once burned like a second sun. They spoke of the books lost to Caesar's fire, to Rome's conquest, to time itself. And they mourned. In them, Alexandria was not a city, but an idea, that knowledge could be gathered, shared, made holy through understanding. Meanwhile, in the ruins by the coast, the sands crept inward, grain by grain. The colonnades that once echoed with Hypatia's voice became silent vaults. The great harbour, once alive with ships and scholars, filled with reeds. Even the sea seemed to retreat, as if ashamed to look upon what it had once reflected. The people who remained built smaller homes among the ruins, living beside the gods of the world's first university without knowing it. At night, under the desert stars, the wind carried faint sounds, the rattle of broken marble, the whisper of waves against forgotten keys. Some said they could hear pages turning beneath the sand. Others said the gods of knowledge still walked the ruins, invisible, searching for their names. And sometimes, when the moon was full, the lighthouse would shimmer faintly on the horizon, though it had long been destroyed, as if the sea itself refused to forget the path of light. Forgetting, like erosion, is slow but relentless. Each generation lost a little more. A name, a date, a story, a truth. What had once been the centre of the world's mind became a myth spoken by travellers. The desert did not rage against the city. It merely waited. It filled the spaces left by neglect, pressed its patience into the stones, and swallowed memory grain by grain until only the outline of greatness remained. Yet even in ruin, Alexandria was beautiful. Its walls, half buried in gold dust, glowed at sunset like embers refusing to die. Its broken columns cast long shadows across the sand, like the fingers of a civilization reaching toward a vanished sky. And though its people no longer studied the stars still watched over them, as if remembering when their patterns were once read with reverence. A poet passing through the city wrote, "Here the wind speaks Greek to the stones, and the stones answer in Arabic." He understood that the city had not truly died. It had changed tongues. The knowledge that once filled its halls had travelled east, reborn in new languages. Alexandria had become not a place, but a seed carried by wind. The desert did not know it was burying memory. It only knew how to cover what men abandoned. But beneath its quiet weight, the library's ghost remained, dreaming in silence, waiting for another dawn. For the desert, too, keeps secrets. And sometimes, when the wind rises just right, it sounds almost like the turning of a page. The desert keeps its memories well. It buries, but it does not erase. Beneath the dunes, under centuries of wind and silence, fragments of a vanished world sleep like embers waiting for air. The people who walk its edge have forgotten the language of those ruins, but not the feeling they carry. That something vast once lived there, something that knew the stars by name. And so the stories began. They were told in the markets of Cairo, in the courtyards of Damascus, in the camps of travellers who had passed by the ruins and felt the air shift around them. They said there were tunnels beneath the sand, chambers where the last scholars of the library hid the forbidden books before the city fell. Others swore that a single scroll survived intact, sealed in glass and gold, buried where the sea once met the desert. Some claimed that at night, when the wind moved through the pillars, one could hear voices murmuring in ancient tongues. Not ghosts, but the pages themselves, still reading themselves aloud. Historians dismiss such tales as superstition, yet the stories endured, refusing to die. Perhaps because humanity cannot bear the thought that knowledge can vanish completely. To imagine the library truly gone would be to accept that even wisdom is mortal. And so, the myth was mercy. It allowed people to believe that somewhere beneath the endless sand, light still slept. Centuries passed, empires changed hands, dynasties rose and fell, and still the stories wandered. Travellers came from far lands to seek the lost books of Alexandria. Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Christians. None found what they sought, but all left believing they had glimpsed its spirit. A scrap of parchment in a monk's hand, a carving half buried in the sand, a ruined archway facing the sea. These became relics of the unseen. One tale spoke of a fisherman who, after a storm, found a sealed jar washed ashore. Inside was a single sheet of papyrus, its ink still black, its words still clear. He could not read the language, but when he showed it to a scholar, she wept. "It is not what it says," she told him, "but that it still dares to speak." The fisherman buried it again, saying, "The sea wanted this kept." And in the way of myths, his story became a parable. That knowledge, once born, will always find a way to return to the world, even if only as rumour. In the age of caliphs, when Baghdad's house of wisdom flourished, some said that the lost scrolls had travelled there, not in their bodies, but in their spirit, that the astronomers who mapped the heavens and the physicians who healed the sick were the descendants of that vanished library. The scholars themselves did not deny it. Every book, they said, is Alexandria remembering. And perhaps they were right, for knowledge never truly belongs to one place. It migrates, like birds, following the seasons of curiosity. But in the ruins by the coast, the silence deepened. Sand drifted over broken columns. Shells filled the cracks of marble floors. The old harbour became a lagoon of reeds. The wind hummed through the arches like a distant hymn. The people who lived nearby grew used to the ruins. To them, they were simply part of the landscape, like cliffs or clouds. Yet every few generations, a child would wander among them and feel something stir. A sense that the ground itself remembered. One such legend told of a boy who followed a storm into the ruins and found, beneath a fallen pillar, a slab carved with strange symbols. He brought it to a priest, who said it was nothing but pagan nonsense and ordered it reburied. But that night, the boy dreamt of a woman of light drawing circles in the air, her voice soft as the wind. Remember what was written in the stars. When he awoke, he could still see the pattern she had drawn, and he spent the rest of his life trying to describe it. The story spread. Some called the woman Hypatia. Others called her the spirit of the library. For in the imagination of the people, she had never died. She had simply become the desert's whisper. In her silence, they heard longing. In her patience, hope. And so the myths of the final books multiplied. Tales of secret vaults, hidden archives, immortal scribes who wrote upon air instead of parchment. The world forgot the truth, but in forgetting, it found beauty. Sometimes memory survives best when it becomes legend. When travellers passed the ruins at dusk, they said the sand itself seemed to shimmer faintly, as if reflecting a buried light. And from afar, where the last rays of sun struck the broken columns, the ruins looked like shelves rising from the earth, a mirage of the library, half dream, half memory. In that mirage, the lost and the found became one. The past and the present blurred, and the desert, vast and silent, kept its secret, that what is buried by time is never truly gone, only waiting for another hand, another age, to lift the sand and begin reading again. The centuries drifted like dunes. The world turned, empires rose, faiths changed, and still the ruins slept beneath the wind. The desert had done its work well. Patient, unjudging, absolute. It covered the stones, filled the colonnades, silenced the voices. Where once stood the beating heart of thought, there was only the murmur of sand. Alexandria was still spoken of, but only as a legend. Travellers told stories of a city swallowed by time, where the sea met the desert, and both conspired to keep its secrets. No one remembered the faces of the philosophers, or the sound of their lectures. No one spoke the names carved into marble now worn smooth by centuries of dust. The library had become a dream of a dream, not a place, but a shadow of yearning. In that long sleep, knowledge was not gone. It was dreaming. Dreaming of the hands that would one day touch it again. Dreaming of light, of paper, of voices asking questions without fear. The earth remembers differently than man. It forgets the surface, but keeps what lies deep. Beneath the dunes, the bones of the city remained. The steps of the Museion, the cracked mosaic floors, the outlines of rooms where thought had once been law. From above, the ruins looked like scars on the land. Caravans passed without noticing. Shepherds grazed flocks across fallen temples. The wind sang through the hollows like an ancient chant. Only the stars still watched faithfully, their cold fire tracing the same constellations the scholars had once mapped. The heavens had not forgotten the eyes that had studied them. In distant monasteries, far from the coast, a few scrolls still survived, copied and recopied through generations of patient hands. Their authors' names had faded, but their ideas endured in fragments, woven into prayers and proverbs. The monks who wrote them no longer knew they were guardians of the library's ghost. To them, these words were simply beautiful, and beauty was reason enough to preserve them. As centuries passed, the desert swallowed even memory itself. Cities rose and fell in other lands. New faiths drew new maps of truth. The ruins of Alexandria lay beneath the sand like a sleeping god, powerful, forgotten, at peace. The people nearby built villages from its stones, unaware that they were raising their homes upon the remnants of civilization's first mind. But even in forgetting, something sacred endured. Every age, no matter how devout or dark, has its wanderers, souls restless for the unseen. From time to time, one would stand upon the buried city and feel the faint tremor beneath their feet, as if the ground itself breathed. They could not name it, but they sensed it, the presence of something greater than time. Poets felt it first. They wrote of a hidden kingdom beneath the desert, where the voices of the wise still echoed. They imagined halls lit by invisible fire, shelves of light instead of wood, and scrolls made of air that whispered truths to those who listened with their hearts. Perhaps they were wrong. But perhaps, in a deeper way, they were right. For what is imagination, if not the dream of memory refusing to die? One legend said that every 1,000 years, when the moon reached its fullest, the sand above the library would tremble, just enough for the earth to sigh. The sound, faint but real, was said to be the library exhaling, the spirit of knowledge reminding the world that it was still there, waiting. Forgetting, it seems, is never final. Beneath each silence lies a hidden rhythm. Beneath each ruin a seed of return. The desert, for all its vast indifference, became the guardian of a promise that nothing meaningful is ever truly lost, only hidden until it is needed again. And so the library slept. It slept through crusades and caliphates, through plagues and prayers, through empires that had never heard its name. It slept until its legend became the only truth that mattered. A story so beautiful that even disbelief could not destroy it. For some stories are not remembered because they happened. They are remembered because they must. And as the last light of day sank behind the dunes, the wind rose, carrying across the sand a sound faint and hollow, like pages turning in a book no one could see. The library dreamed on, its silence vast, its memory endless, its awakening inevitable. The world turned again. The sands shifted, and from their silence, voices began to rise. Not the voices of Alexandria's lost scholars, but their descendants in spirit, men and women born far from the ruins, yet haunted by their echo. Across the deserts and mountains, across centuries of faith and forgetting, the old light stirred. The embers that had slept beneath the ashes began to breathe again. In the east, under the banners of Islam, a new hunger awoke, not for conquest, but for understanding. The caliphs of Baghdad built the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, a library vast and luminous, as if the ghost of Alexandria had found its body once more. There, translators worked by lamplight, their ink dark as night, their devotion bright as dawn. They copied texts from Greece, Persia, and India, rescuing ideas from oblivion. Arabic became the new vessel of reason. Euclid spoke again in the language of the Quran. Galen healed through the hands of Muslim physicians. Aristotle argued in the courts of caliphs. From the ashes of one civilization, another began to rise, not as imitation, but as continuation. The words of the ancients were no longer pagan relics, they were keys to understanding the divine order of creation. And so, in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cordoba, the Library of Alexandria was reborn, not in marble, but in minds. The scholars of Islam studied the stars and called it worship. They mapped the heavens with reverence, named the constellations in Arabic, and measured the motions of planets with tools finer than any forged before. To them, science was a form of prayer, precision as devotion, knowledge as gratitude. The House of Wisdom became a beacon. Its halls glowed with oil lamps. Its courtyards hummed with languages from every corner of the world. Philosophers debated beside poets. Physicians worked beside theologians. The spirit of inquiry that once defined Alexandria lived again, transformed, sanctified, alive. For these scholars saw no conflict between faith and reason. They believed that to seek knowledge was to follow the path of God's own light, and that light travelled. From the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Spain, caravans carried books instead of weapons. In the universities of Cordoba and Toledo, the knowledge preserved by Muslim hands passed into Latin, returning, like a long-forgotten exile, to the West. The words that had crossed languages and continents began to awaken another sleeping world. Europe, darkened for centuries by war and superstition, began to remember. The spark that had burned in Alexandria flickered once more in Florence and Venice, in Paris and Prague. It glowed in the eyes of men who bent over dusty manuscripts, struggling to decipher what their ancestors had lost. The Renaissance was not born from invention, but from remembrance, a recovery of forgotten brilliance. The philosophers of Greece spoke again through Arabic tongues. Ptolemy guided new astronomers. Plato whispered to artists painting the faces of saints. Hypatia's spirit, that steadfast flame, seemed to move among them, unseen, shaping their thoughts. Wherever the mind awoke, her ghost followed. And though no one called it so, this rebirth was Alexandria's second dawn. Her library had never truly perished. It had scattered, transformed, and now it returned, carried in parchment and prayer. The faith that once silenced her now helped preserve her memory. Monks, scholars, and astronomers alike knelt before their books, as if before an altar. They understood at last that light could be both holy and human, both a gift from heaven and a creation of the mind. But even in this golden rebirth, the memory of loss lingered. In every library built, there was a shadow of the one that burned. Every candle lit to study recalled the fire that had destroyed. The world had learned, through tragedy, that knowledge is fragile, and that forgetting is always waiting. A poet of Andalusia wrote, "We are the children of smoke and script, writing by the fire that once consumed our fathers." He was right. Humanity had risen from its own ashes, carrying in its hands both the wound and the cure. The scholars of the New World studied the heavens, the body, the soul, not to defy God, but to understand him more deeply. In their faith, they rediscovered wonder. In their curiosity, they found devotion. And so, through translation, through study, through the courage to ask again, the ghosts of light awoke. They walked once more through the world, clothed not in marble or scroll, but in the minds of those who refused to forget. And somewhere beneath the desert of Egypt, where the wind still whispered through the ruins of the old library, it was said the sand began to tremble, as if the earth itself recognized its reflection in the living fire of human thought. The dawn of reason came quietly. It did not begin with fanfare or revelation, but with a page turned, with a candle lit in a cold room, with ink drying on trembling hands. The world had begun to awaken once more, slowly remembering that the mind, too, is a form of light. The rediscovered books of the ancients, carried through centuries of translation and devotion, became seeds in new soil. From those seeds grew the gardens of science, philosophy, and art. Men who had never seen Alexandria spoke as if haunted by her voice. Copernicus studying the stars, Galileo peering through his glass, Da Vinci sketching the mechanics of wings, all were children of her spirit. They had inherited her defiance, her curiosity, her hunger to see what lay beyond the veil. Europe, once veiled in dogma, began to breathe differently. The scholars of the Renaissance gave way to thinkers who dared to test, to measure, to doubt. Faith, though still sacred, met its reflection in reason. The church wall that once guarded mystery began to echo with the sound of questions. The same silence that had buried Hypatia now trembled beneath the footsteps of minds unwilling to kneel before certainty. They called it progress, though it was in truth remembrance, the return of an old courage. For every equation solved, every law discovered, was not merely an act of brilliance, but an echo of that first flame. The world didn't invent reason anew, it rediscovered it, brushing the soot of centuries from its surface. In laboratories that smelled of smoke and metal, new fires burned, fires of experiment, of revelation. The alchemist's furnace became the physicist's crucible. The philosopher's ink became the scientist's formula. And each discovery, each fragile truth, was a page rewritten in the long, unfinished book of humanity's awakening. Some feared this fire. They remembered what happened the last time man had worshipped his own intellect. They saw in the telescopes and engines the arrogance of Babel reborn. But others saw something holier, the unfolding of creation through understanding. For to study the laws of the universe was perhaps to glimpse the handwriting of God himself. The boundaries between the sacred and the scientific blurred. Astronomers spoke of harmony in the heavens. Physicians called the body a miracle of design. Even the mathematicians, tracing patterns of infinity, felt awe rather than pride. In their precision, they found poetry. In their certainty, humility. Knowledge, after all, was not an escape from faith. It was another way of kneeling before the vastness of the unknown. And so, the fire spread, from Europe to the East, from empires to colonies, from parchment to print. The printing press became a second library, a machine that turned memory into immortality. Words could no longer be confined to a single city, a single empire, or a single creed. The Library of Alexandria, once bound by stone, now lived in paper, in ink, in the hearts of millions. But every light casts a shadow. The same fire that illuminated the world also forged weapons. The age of reason birthed machines that could heal and kill. Knowledge grew faster than wisdom, and once again humanity stood trembling before its own creation. The old story repeated itself. Discovery and destruction, faith and doubt, fire and ash. Yet even through its errors the mind endured. Every generation found new ways to rebuild the light, through science, through art, through the quiet defiance of thinkers who refused to stop asking why. The library no longer existed in walls or scrolls. It lived in the network of human thought, vast, interwoven, infinite. A poet of the modern age wrote, "We light our cities as if to blind the stars, but in every spark the ancient flame remains." And it was true. The light that once burned in Alexandria had never been extinguished, only transformed. It now lived in laboratories, observatories, universities, in the hum of machines and the silence of study. Wherever there was wonder, she was there. The spirit of the library reborn again and again in every age that dared to think. For knowledge, like fire, cannot be owned, only carried. It leaps from hand to hand, from heart to heart, across the long, dark corridors of history. Each time it is passed, it changes shape, but its essence remains. The desire to understand, to illuminate, to endure. And so the fire still burns. It burns in equations and art, in medicine and philosophy. It burns in those who dream, and in those who dare to question. It burns in you, in me, in every mind that refuses the comfort of ignorance. Somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, the old stones still sleep, but above them their fire moves through a world brighter than ever. For though the library of Alexandria fell, the spirit that built it never did. The fire still burns in the mind of man, in the endless search for light. Night again, but not the night of darkness, the night before dawn. A quiet world hums beneath its stars, full of lights no fire ever kindled. The glow of cities, of circuits, of minds awake. Humanity, after millennia of rising and falling, still walks the same ancient road. From ignorance to knowledge, from light to ash, from ash to light again. We are the heirs of that first flame. The lines of thought that once traced constellations in the library's halls now pulse through machines of glass and wire. Knowledge travels faster than wind, further than any empire. The dream of Alexandria has become invisible everywhere. A library not of walls, but of waves, where every voice can speak, every question can be asked, and yet the silence remains. For every answer found, 1,000 new mysteries unfold. We have mapped the stars, split the atom, digitized the word, and still we stand at the edge of the unknown, the same trembling creatures that once knelt beneath the dome of the Museum. Our tools have changed, our hunger has not. We are still seeking the pattern behind the pattern, the order behind the noise. Perhaps this is what the library was always meant to teach, that knowledge is not a possession, but a motion, a tide that rises, falls, and rises again. Its fire burns through us, not for us. We are not its masters, but its vessels. Every discovery, every invention, every thought that breaks the silence, all are echoes of that same eternal act, the desire to understand. The story has never ended, only changed its form. In every age the flame finds new shapes. A scroll, a telescope, a book, a screen. It lives in the questions of a child, in the code of a machine, in the trembling of a scientist before a mystery too vast to name. Even now, when we believe ourselves enlightened, we stand no higher than those who came before, only further along the same spiral. The circle turns, the fire returns, and each generation must decide what to preserve and what to burn. For the danger never vanished. The same forces that once silenced Hypatia still move among us: fear, pride, power, certainty. Libraries can fall again, not by fire, but by forgetting. The destruction of knowledge no longer needs flames. It needs only indifference. In an age of abundance, silence has learned new forms. It hides not in darkness, but in distraction. And yet, the flame endures. Because somewhere, always, someone begins again. A child opens a book. A thinker questions a truth. A poet names the nameless. And in that small act of curiosity, the ancient library breathes once more. Its walls rise unseen, its corridors echo again with the sound of turning pages, its torches rekindled in the minds of those who dare to seek. The circle completes itself. The knowledge once born by the sea now circles the earth. What was once destroyed in fire now moves through light, through the pulse of data, through the shimmer of screens, through the whispers of minds that refuse to forget. The library lives in all who wonder. Its story is the story of us, fragile, relentless, radiant. And perhaps that is the final truth, that the library was never only a building, nor a place in time. It was a promise, a covenant between the human soul and the infinite, that as long as we remember, as long as we question, the light will never die. So the wheel turns once more. The fire burns, the ashes cool. The wind carries them to new hands, new hearts, new ages. And somewhere, beneath the eternal hum of creation, a familiar voice whispers, not from heaven, but from within. Let there be light. There is a silence that follows every great fire, not the silence of death, but of breath held between worlds. Alexandria still lives in that silence, not in her stones nor her ruins, but in the quiet persistence of thought, in the fragile, luminous thread that runs through every mind that dares to ask why. The library burned, yes, once in flame, and 1,000 times in forgetting. But even fire could not claim what it did not understand. For what Alexandria created was not merely knowledge, but a way of seeing. The belief that truth, however distant, could be reached if one only walked toward it with open eyes. Her ashes scattered across empires, carried by merchants, monks and dreamers. They settled in Baghdad, in Toledo, in Florence, in the hands of astronomers who mapped the stars she once studied, in the hearts of poets who found divinity in reason. Every age that lifted its gaze from the ground became, in some small way, her heir. We are those heirs now. We carry her fire in our screens, in our circuits, in the quiet hum of our machines. We ask the same questions, though in new languages. We build our libraries in clouds instead of marble, infinite, invisible, eternal. Yet the danger remains the same, that in our abundance we may forget to wonder. For the death of knowledge has never come by fire alone. It comes in apathy, in the comfort that asks nothing, in the noise that drowns reflection. When we stop seeking, when we stop doubting, the flame fades again into ash. And yet, somehow, it always returns. Because somewhere, always, a child will look at the stars and feel the same pull that once drew men to the shores of Egypt. Somewhere, a voice will rise against silence and say, "There is more to know." And in that instant, fleeting, defiant, divine, Alexandria lives again. Perhaps that is what eternity truly means. Not endless time, but endless remembering. A cycle of loss and rediscovery, of burning and rebuilding. A testament to the stubborn hope that knowledge, like light, cannot be unmade. And so, as the last page closes, the wind passes softly through the ruins by the sea. The sand shifts, the stars shimmer, and the world continues to dream. Somewhere beneath those endless grains, a single ember still glows. Small, unseen, but alive. Waiting, as it always has, for someone to come again and begin the story anew.